present as I introduce Dr. Deborah Hardy, who is an assistant professor in art education at the Peck School of the Arts at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And Dr. Hardy's interests includes the histories of Black schools and urban cities, the histories of art education, community arts, museum education, critical race theory, Black feminist theory, and anti-racist teaching practices. She has published in the Journal of Cultural Research in Art Education and Curriculum and Teaching Dialogue, along with chapters in the Palgrave Handbook of Race and the Arts and Arts and Education, and Revitalizing Histories, and the most recently published, The Political Turn, Promoting Civic Engagement Through Art and Education.
All right, thank you all for being here. I'm really excited to get to share my research. Again, my name is Dr. Deborah Hardy, and my research this summer I kind of entitled Illuminating the Expanse of Chicago's Artist-Educators Networks, 1930s to 1960s. What we will see throughout this presentation and kind of what I talk about is that time has kind of expanded, and so has the definitions of artist and educator. So I really want to thank the BMRC for this fellowship. It was a really impactful experience over the summer. So I want to start kind of with why I am interested in this. So as a art educator, a lot of the ways that we are taught about our histories tends to come from a very Eurocentric lens. And so going into my master's program, they sit us down, they talk about people like Dewey, and then into educators like Victor Lowenfeld, who are really important within the histories of art education. However, they really focus on white teachers, white policymakers, and the K-12 public school system. And that leaves a lot of people out of that narrative. So my question when I was starting my master's program were, where is everybody else? And that question has evolved into, where are the Black art teachers? This is a wonderful picture. Charles White is over here on the right. I do want to say that my definition of educator is pretty loose. It encapsulates many different forms of artistic knowledge sharing between Black individuals. I don't really want to box it in because sometimes when we talk about educator, what we end up meaning is this very small understanding of K-12 teachers or university professors. But the realities of Black education show us that boxing in is actually not how knowledge is shared in all settings and situations. And particularly when we're talking about the contentious history of Black education, with things like Jim Crow laws and de facto segregation, that becomes really hard to just focus on, these very formalized pieces. And so instead, what I wanted to look at is knowledge sharing in a much broader sense. I want to point out that this history comes from a lineage. So in 2013 was when I took my first, that was my master's program. I took my first history of art education course. And in that course, they asked us to write a paper. And that paper was supposed to be about the history of art education in some way. And I went to the library and I was looking for books and I found this one about the Works Progress Administration's history in Illinois. And I was like, I'm from Illinois. Let's look into this. And they had 6 paragraphs about the Southside Community Arts Center. And my interest was really piqued. And so I ended up digging, for this term paper for this class. And then I just kept digging more and more and more, and it ended up becoming my master's thesis. And so the thesis, the kind of major question that I was interested in was around what forces assisted the Southside Community Arts Center to survive until the present day when so many other art centers, there were about 100 of them, closed their doors. And what I ended up finding was that middle-class Black women were really the center of the art center, especially during the 50s, during one of their very first kind of hard moments, where a lot of centers would have closed their doors. The art center had already kind of established its value. And part of this was that there were middle class women who were able to recognize that value, but also that value came from the artists themselves. So the core artists that were coming out of the Southside Community Arts Center were so impactful that they helped, folks who were not artists realize that this was really important for us. We need to make sure that this continues, and it continues to this day, which is very exciting. And it's still this, you know, beautiful space to be in with a lot of history and now continuing into the future. But I didn't stop there. I ended up in doing my doctoral work, still kind of wrestling with some of the things that I learned from my master's thesis. And so I was like kind of digging, and particularly Margaret Burroughs, just as a figure, was one of those folks who just kind of kept sticking into my mind. I kept wanting to learn more, and I kept wanting to find new stories and narratives. And there's just so many beautiful stories about her that I ended up writing my dissertation about her teaching practices. And so some of the questions that I was looking at then were really about her using her art classroom space because she was a K-12 teacher. And specifically, how did the Bronzeville neighborhood itself kind of influence what she ended up doing later? And a lot of the conclusions that I came to through that were actually dictated by theory. So as you can tell by the 2022 on this, I was writing my dissertation during the pandemic. And so my access to archives were really limited. And so I was still able to go into the archives, and I was still able to do some work, but a lot of what I was able to do had to be dictated through theory. And so I used fugitive pedagogy as kind of a lens to look at what Margaret was able to do in the classroom. Kind of pulling from Carter G. Woodson and the most recent book by Jarvis Gibbons, Fugitive Pedagogy, to understand the ways that she was using her classroom space, and then also the ways that that teaching style has limitations to it. And that kind of can explain a little bit why she ended up moving into public work as part of her helping to found the DuSable Museum, establishing it in her home, and then as it moved into the public space. But even after my dissertation, even after all of this time with Burroughs and teaching, I still had questions. And so some of the questions that kind of kept lingering for me included the fact that Margaret was always a part of a community. And so who were in these communities? How did they sustain themselves? And how did that help launch important Black artists, particularly in the Renaissance, but then also afterwards? What were some of the mechanisms that kept art a viable pathway when markets excluded Black artists, especially in Chicago, where a lot of the galleries on the north side did not allow for Black artists to show their work? How did art still sustain itself as a viable career path for folks? What were the things that they were doing to circumnavigate these racist beliefs that were held in these institutional spaces? And then how did artist educators kind of continue to support future generations of Black Chicago artists? So while my initial research was really focused between, the 30s and into the 50s, who else was a part of this, and how did they kind of support artists beyond, their own generation? And particularly who in Margaret's generation made it possible for Black arts to thrive in the next generation? So this comes to what I actually decided to do my research about with the BMRC. So the questions that I really focused on were what lineages and connections existed within Chicago's Bronzeville network, particularly ones between friends, mentors, and students. This question kind of comes up because when we talk about genealogy, especially for researchers, we're often looking at people who were directly connected to each other. So we're talking about dissertation advisors and students. But that's not necessarily how artists form community. And so what are the ways that these communities also operated in the same way where these friendships and mentorships, especially informal mentorships, were just as important and vital to them sustaining their careers. And then what are the legacies of these initial connections? So how did artists and educators continue to support each other and future generations? So again, thinking long term, not just this kind of flash in the pan moment that happened during, the Chicago Renaissance, which was a beautiful moment, but how did that sustain? What were the ways that what happened during the Renaissance continues to have reverberations until this day? These are the questions that I kind of came into my research with. As part of my research at in Chicago during between end of June and the end of July, I visited 5 archives. So specifically the Ryerson Library at the Art Institute. That was my first time at that particular institution. The Harsh Collection over at Woodson Regional Library, which I've been to many times, but it was the first time that I had access to a couple of these archives. The Southside Community Center archives that are currently housed at Columbia College, the Harold Washington Library, special collections, particularly their uh, massive collection of art books, particularly focusing on Chicago artists, and the DuSable Museum archives. This was the one that I spent the most time in, that I will discuss a little bit later, but this was also one of the ones that I did not get to access during my dissertation work and was one that was very important for me to spend time in. So here's my full archive list and the amount of visits that I went. So you can tell that I was looking at a lot of stuff, especially in the Harsh collection. I was going kind of through a lot of their different collections. It was the first time that I had accessed Marion Perkins papers, the William Edward Scott papers, and the Calvin B. Jones papers. The DuSable Museum, I was really just focusing on Dr. Burroughs' own collection, but I was really spending a lot of time there. I ended up going, I believe, 8 times over the course of my summer. Ryerson Library, this was the first time I was there, and so I accessed the Esther Sparks papers, all of their artist files, and then the Kathleen Blackshear papers, who Kathleen Blackshear was a educator. She was an art history professor at the School of the Art Institute, and she was really one of the folks who kept Black students staying at the Art Institute. And so it was really nice getting to look at some of her syllabi and what she was teaching. And though it doesn't feel revolutionary today, it was revolutionary when she was doing it. And then looking at the Southside Community Arts Center archive. And so I found just like a lot of really beautiful things while I was looking. So on the top here, you can see these are pictures of Margaret and Charlie Burroughs as kind of the first iteration of the DuSable. I love these little um, pictures, little snapshots into kind of what that first iteration kind of looked like. On the bottom here, I have a letter from Archie Motley, who in archivist circles is an important voice, but also his father, being Archibald Motley Jr., was another, like, he was a important Black artist that didn't necessarily have a relationship with Margaret when she was younger, but as they stayed in Chicago, she was one of the folks who helped kind of preserve and keep his legacy going. And then all the way on the right is a piece from Kathleen Blackshear's collection where she was when she was a student at the Art Institute. And although she was a white teacher and a white woman, she really had a deep love and respect for Black individuals starting very, very early. And I just really love this beautiful gouache painting. But during this process, there were a handful of kind of challenges that I experienced. The main one being Margaret's archive itself. So Dr. Burroughs was a monumental figure and somebody who did a lot of really beautiful work. However, the way that she organized her own ideas is idiosyncratic. It doesn't necessarily work within an archivist's mind where, when I go into somewhere like the Harsh collection, I'm ready to have one file with one piece of paper in it, and I know which one it is because it's part of uh, the cataloging system. Margaret doesn't have that right now. So instead, what they have are just thousands and thousands and thousands of letters. And these letters are put into uh, folders, but they are not organized. And so I spent, I said that I went 8 times, but I was there from about 11 a.m. to about 4 p.m. every single day that I was there, going through these letters. And I found beautiful pieces like this one on the right, which is a letter from Elizabeth Catlett to Margaret in the 1960s. It's labeled Mora because that was her name after she married for the second time. But this was, in between pieces that were her histories as a park commissioner and letters from the 1990s. There was no organizational system to get this information. And so a lot of what I was doing was just going through and understanding who Margaret was just kind of as a individual and why she kept all of these materials. And for anybody who is interested, there is so much to talk about in terms of her international travel that I was not able to even touch, or even her work in the prison systems, which she has thousands of letters from prisoners uh, who were writing her about her classes that she taught that I just was not able to go through due to the time constraints. So I was finding these little gems in between all of this other ephemera. So I would joke about this with my partner. I would be at the end of a box and be like, oh, I'm so close to the end. And then I would pull it out and this letter would be there. And I'd be like, okay, well, now I have to, I write down what's the contents of these letters because I'm likely not going to know where I'm going to find this again. And also, I don't know where this information can kind of lead me because some of the things in here might lead into another piece. Just briefly, I want to touch on one of the ways that I organize all of this information because I was taking in a lot over the summer and I needed a way to organize that information. So what I used was a program called Obsidian, which is a free note-taking software that allows for an internal tagging of documents. So this connected network helped me create a way to see these strands and these connections in real time. So here is an image of what my Obsidian network looks like. These are all just files and they're all demonstrating the tags to and from each other. So I've color coordinated it for ease of reading. So red are anybody who is an artist. Green are locations. So this would be the Southside Community Arts Center, the School of the Art Institute, the Southside Settlement House, etc. Light blue are events, which I consider to be things like exhibitions. So anytime an exhibition was happening, if I was able to find the catalog, I would list all of the artists who are part of that and tag them together. And then the purple are secondary sources. So any source that I found that was talking about one or more of these people, I also added in here. So you can see that there are quite a few secondary sources that talk a lot about a lot of these artists. But even that is only a fraction of what I have been able to do. So all of these light gray dots are people who have been mentioned who I haven't been able to actually make a file for yet. I was only able to do so much over the summer doing, that primary document research. And so I found a lot of names that I haven't been able to figure out who they are yet. And so there's even more people than who I have currently who might be a part of this, maybe even in a small piece, but I want to explore those connections even further. So on the right, you can see that so if I pulled out Margaret in particular, you can see all of the people that she was connected to, all those red dots. All of the exhibitions that she was in are the light blue dots. The purple ones are the places that she was a part of. So you can see how all of these things start to connect to each other. Um, what was nice about this is that it helps me to keep track of all of these connections, and particularly finding who and how these places are important through this visual weight. So the larger they are, the more times that they're getting tagged, right? So things like exhibitions are going to be a little bit larger just simply by the fact that they have a lot of artists in them. But finding out, how important that exhibition was, did that lead to something else? What was the time scale of the exhibition? All of these can start to add into a narrative. So, oh man, my slide didn't totally work as I wanted it to. That's fine. I want to explore one of these kind of in details just so I can explain what I'm doing. So we'll look at George Neal as an example. So George Neal died when he was 32 in 1940-ish. George was an artist and he was very young and very enthusiastic. And he is an important figure within the narratives of other artists, but we don't really know a lot about him as an individual. This piece, called The Hat, might be one of the few pieces that I have been able to find of his. And this is from an exhibition catalog, and it's just like the little image on the exhibition catalog. So I wanted to understand a little bit more about George Neal and his own influences. So George Neal worked at the Southside Settlement House, which was established by Ada McKinley. He was an arts instructor there. Um, Settlement houses being kind of one of these informal spaces prior to places like the Southside Community Arts Center for education to be transmitted. Um, he was also at the same time a student at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And in these spaces, what he would do is he would take the knowledge that he had as a student and then bring it down to the South Side. So the Art Institute is about, 3 miles away from where he was living. He would go up, take a night class, come back, and then teach students what he had just been taught. He met up with William McGill, who is another artist I don't necessarily know a lot about yet, but was a sign painter at the time, who established the Arts Crafts Guild in 1934. And this was a space where they were bringing together kind of emerging artists and youth together at the same time in order to kind of establish a network. So you might recognize some of these names. These are some of the students, particularly young students, who were a part of the Arts Crafts Guild. So at the time that this was being founded, Charles White, who was born in like 1917, would have been, 15, 16 years old. This was one of their first basis of knowledge production and learning that they could be artists and what that looks like. So folks like, again, White, Margaret Burroughs, Eldzier Cortor, Bernard Goss, Fred Hollingsworth, William Carter, all of these people started at the Arts Crafts Guild and having this work, and George Neal being kind of the glue of part of this network. And then later, all of these individuals helped found the Southside Community Arts Center. At the time, again, George Neal passed away in 1940. Not a lot of details about what happened, other than that he was not a part of the founding of the Southside Community Arts Center in the same way that we would kind of think, especially during this heyday between 1940 and 1943, because he passed away. But his influence is still felt within all of those artists who had initially started and began their work with him in the Arts Crafts Guild. And so I want to just map all of these together. And then when you look at this, there's even further connections. I didn't highlight these because it's just a lot, but Margaret and Charlie had a relationship together. They were friends for their lives. Margaret ended up marrying Bernard Goss as her first husband. There are interconnections between these people as well. It's not just a linear progress. They are over and over and over each other. So my current analysis kind of shows three generations of these Black artist educators in Chicago. So we have this first wave of Black graduates from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. This was something that I had not explored before, but you get folks like William Edward Scott coming out of this generation of artists who were coming like really turn of the century. I want to say like 1907 to like 1918, starting integration of the School of the Art Institute. From there, you have this second generation coming out of the Chicago Renaissance. So these would be the Burroughs, Whites, Elizabeth Catlett, Bernard Goss. And then there's also a third generation coming out of the Black arts movement. So you have organizations like OBC and AfriCobra who are coming out of the 60s and 70s, often connected to individuals who are part of the Renaissance as a way to kind of step into leadership positions. Some of these friendships and relationships span generations. And I think that's something that I had not really considered before. I knew somebody like Margaret, who stayed in Chicago, was one of these, but I just didn't realize the depth of them when I was initially doing this. I think there are a couple of stories that I think are illustrative here. One of them being that, Margaret was friends and continued to be a mentor to somebody like Eugene Perkins, whose father had passed away in 1960. They were still keeping up with each other beyond Marion's death. Same goes with, Charles White, who passed away in 1979. Margaret was still in contact with him basically up until he passed, and then continued contact with his widow and her children. Even though Charles had not lived in Chicago since like 1942, they had still continued this relationship as like a network. People like Elizabeth Catlett, who they continue to have friendships for decades and decades. These networks also expanded beyond Chicago and then kind of moved into international and national events. So one thing that I want to kind of continue exploring are some of these more international connections. So Burroughs being a figure who would go over to the Soviet Union, who took deliberate trips to Africa. What are these more international connections that I have not explored yet? But knowing that they are not just Chicago bound, but they are much wider than that. One of the ones that I kind of keep looking at is the influence of Burroughs on other Black arts institutions, particularly in Detroit, and kind of thinking about that as another kind of avenue for research. And then something that I think is really important is also understanding that exhibitions and art shows were an important part of sustaining artistic viability. So these art shows, these spaces that people would begin in were incredibly important to keeping artists employed, helping them find people who were going to buy their artwork, helping them create new markets and avenues for each other, and really thinking about exhibitions as part of this lineage. It also helps put people together in new ways. And I'm curious about like what happens when you have people across generations who are in an art show together. Are there connections that are made through these spaces as well? I also just love this picture. This is from the Marion Perkins papers, and it kind of shows the variety of who was a part of these networks. And so you have white individuals like Margaret Brundage and Tom Conroy, who were just as vital to these communities as people like Burroughs, Gwendolyn Brooks, Marion Perkins, Fern Gaydon, who wasn't really an artist, she was a writer. But it's all so interesting to me. I love it. So I've asked a lot of questions and I still have questions. This research is still ongoing. But so one of the things that or a couple of things I'm looking at still include what are the contemporary reverberations of these networks, either in Chicago or beyond? Um, how can these grassroots networks and community inform contemporary artist educators, particularly in times of political upheaval and attacks on freedom of speech? This is something that I think is really interesting to think about in terms of looking at the ways that uh, these communities came out of people coming together. They were not necessarily coming out of an institution. And what does that mean? How can we learn from that, especially when the institutions that maybe we are a part of are failing? Um, Number three, how did these networks work with local youth and to help develop new generations of artists? Because they did, that information is just not as documented. So I have a couple of next steps, including secondary research on places like OBC and Afrocobra, particularly looking at the work of Jeff Donaldson, who I think is a standout between this. Uh, I also want to do further exploration of the National Conference of Artists, which Margaret was a part of the founding of that in 1959. This is something that I did not know about until I started doing research, and I realized that she has helped establish this. She was at the first conference in Atlanta. She was trying to get Charles White to go to it. He got stuck on an airplane. It was a whole big thing. But learning more about this kind of network that was a national network of artists that kind of continued the same piece that maybe she didn't have in Chicago anymore during the 50s. And then learning more kind of about network analysis methodology more broadly. So playing with this idea of these connections and how do I show these connections is something that I want to continue to work with.
I do want to go back and make sure I introduce our discussant, who is Dr. Melanie Chambliss, an assistant professor of history at the University of Rochester. She is currently working on her book manuscript, History in the Making, Black Libraries, Black Archival Agency, and the Remaking of Modernity. Dr. Chambliss explores how Black library builders and users forged and fractured historical authority during the early 20th century. Dr. Chambliss's work has been published in the Journal of African American History, the African American Review Journal, and the edited collection, The Unfinished Book. Her research has been supported by the American Council of Learned Societies, the Institute for Citizens and Scholars, and the Black Metropolis Research Consortium. She is a BMRC Fellow alum from 2014. So she will lead the discussion, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Allison. And I'd also like to thank the BMRC for inviting me to serve as discussant. Dr. Harding, that was a fantastic presentation, so I look forward to learning more about the work. I think I can just start with maybe a question or two and then open it up to the audience. Because you're tracing lineages and connections, and I was really fascinated by the slide kind of connecting George Neal to all these different centers and individuals. I was wondering if you could say more about how you're thinking about your work in connection to the tradition of mapping Black Chicago, like both its physical landscape, but also its social landscape. You mentioned wanting to delve more into network analysis, but you could also just as easily put it in context or in conversation with like Horace Cayton and St. Clair Drake's Black Metropolis. Like there's so much richness that's there, which I think is one of the things that's fascinating about your approach. So have you thought about how you're seeing those connections?
Yeah, so actually, I'm glad that you asked this question, partially because that was something that I did during my dissertation work, because somebody like Margaret had stayed in Chicago, and I was so fascinated with what does it mean to stay within an area, right? And how does she move through this space, and what does it mean to be a part of a community, especially as it starts to fracture? As housing started to open up in the 40s and then later. I was really curious about that. And so I had done a little bit of mapping in my dissertation work, really looking at her home as a part of this. So if you've never been to the Southside Community Arts Center, it's a beautiful space. And if you walk out the door and then turn kitty corner to the right, you will see Margaret's old home. And it's this beautiful building. And it's so curious about like her being literally right next door. And so I had been thinking about this as a spatial project, I think partially just because of the way that Chicago is, where it's like you can go to these places, you can be like, this is where this was, here's this location. Um, and so I am kind of also thinking about that. I am curious, partially because now this is becoming even more international or national, um, how these also kind of form together in those ways. So somebody like Charles White, who moved from Chicago to New York, spent a year in Mexico, and then went to California. Um, the ways that, again, like somebody like Catlett was kind of bouncing around, went to Iowa, Chicago, and then spent most of her life in Mexico City. I was thinking about that and the ways that these connections happen. I also like again thinking about that next generation outside of the Renaissance, the Wall of Respect being like this very singular place that helped bring all of these folks together. Thinking about that in relation to other locations, uh, is something that I am really curious about. I think I was going to say visuality, and I don't love that word. The visualness is something that really kind of gets me because I think we so often think of artists as singular individuals. We think about somebody like, I don't know, Van Gogh as this like individual monumental person, but in reality, we're all made up of networks and we're all connected to individuals. I think one story that kind of sticks out to me is knowing that Carrie James Marshall was a student of Charles White's, and was a very deliberate student of Charles White's, and made the choice to go to Otis to study under Charles White. I Thinking through that as well, and thinking about like the temporality of that. So understanding how these networks changed over time, where they moved and shifted, is something also that I'm thinking about. There's just a lot of ways to kind of think about this space, both visually and then also spatially.
Yeah, and that definitely sounds important. Or thinking about continue or more interventions around what the Chicago Renaissance was, that you can trace those connections outward in a way that we're more familiar maybe with Harlem Renaissance, but that deserves to be traced and explained as well.
Mhm.
Okay. Second question, maybe I can ask before opening things up. Of course, I'm interested in the archival research that you did, especially because you mentioned how different this research was versus what you did during the pandemic with your dissertation. And so, whenever you're thinking about archives, you're thinking of discoveries, but also disappointments. You had mentioned the things that you had learned about Margaret Burroughs, but was there anything where you were going into the archive hoping to find maybe a particular individual or someone within this network that you were starting to map out that you thought would be really influential, or maybe you found someone unexpected that now this is the direction you really want to look?
Yeah, I don't think I found anything that's been disappointing, luckily. I think honestly, it's been more eye-opening to realize all of those individuals that I had initially not picked up on the first reading through. So Margaret has this beautiful chapter in a book from like 1987 where it's like a personal recollection of the founding of the Southside Community Arts Center. And she lists every single person that she could possibly remember was a part of it. And so going back through that list and realizing that some of these names that are just kind of like in this giant list of people were really important is kind of this second level of discovery that I'm going through. I think somebody like Marion Perkins is one that I'd heard the name a lot. I was like, oh yeah, he's a sculptor. But understanding that like he was a self-taught sculptor, he never went to the School of the Art Institute. He kind of he was one of the folks who stayed in Chicago, and then understanding that like his children also had an impact. And, somebody like Useni was doing, literature work in a similar vein, but very different. And that he, like Burroughs and Useni, still continue to stay in conversation with each other, is something that like I am now finding out that I'm finding really, really beautiful, that these connections don't end after, a certain time period or after, this kind of zeitgeist experience, but that there are continued reverberation through time. And, somebody like Useni, I picked up one of his books where he talks a lot about the Black arts movement because he was there, he was doing it. And now I want to understand that a little bit more as well through this other lens of somebody who was a part of that. Um, and I think those are kind of the secondary things that I really want to explore again. I would say also like William Edward Scott. Again, I've been to uh, the Harsh collection so many times, but I had never looked at his papers, and realizing that he was one of the people who was uh, he had made a career for himself, during the 1910s and 1920s. And then in the 30s, he wanted to help young artists start to establish themselves. So he was part of the Southside Community Center's founding, but I had never thought of him as, an artist who was doing this. I just kind of, again, seen the name kind of come through. So it's really that kind of re-exploration of some of the work that I've already done that I find really, really fascinating.
Great, thank you. So I can open the conversation up if there's anyone who wants to either unmute or perhaps put things into the chat. We can go ahead and move to that portion. Okay, while people are kind of putting together ideas or continuing to think, I did have a question about Margaret Burroughs. And one of the things that you said that I thought was really interesting was looking at her as an educator in these different spaces. And so I wondered if you could say a little bit more about Burroughs, either how you compare her style in Chicago Public Schools versus what she was able to create moving into the DuSable or even with the Southside Community Arts Center, or if there's another artist educator that you would compare with.
Mm-hmm. Margaret is such an interesting person because she is one of the few that really did end up going into all of these different spaces. One of the ones that I haven't touched on here, but is something that I found really beautiful while I was doing my dissertation work, was that like her kitchen table became a really, really important gathering space. It was a picnic style table that they had in their carriage house, which is on the backside of the beautiful building that you see on South Michigan, that people would just gather and they would listen to each other. And some of the like theoretical work that I was doing around that was thinking about, the Black kitchen table as this space of knowledge production. And so you have a lot of other theorists who have talked about that, where again, like these spaces, like somewhere like Chicago Public Schools has, you know, their curriculum, their dictation, the intimacy of like the home as a space really became this opportunity for external learning and learning from each other. And so somebody like her husband Charlie, who was uh, a student in the Soviet Union who spoke fluent Russian, was able to teach that when, that knowledge was not valued in his day-to-day life as a delivery driver for a laundromat service, right? And so that became a space to share knowledge in these really beautiful ways. And I think she ended up taking that into a lot more of her work in the community. So part of that being working and establishing the DuSable, her work as she went into prison. So she taught poetry in prisons, both men's and women's prisons. And understanding, I think, and valuing that individuals all have knowledge and that they all can construct knowledge on their own, which I think is really inspiring, especially when in so many other educational spaces, it's a top-down version of knowledge where there is teacher and student, whereas a lot of the other spaces became everybody can be teacher and student. And I think that that was something that I found really fascinating. And I think definitely was something that she took care in when she was working at the DuSable because, she had her collection, especially of artists, that she would help establish with somebody like Bernard, uh, who she didn't even have like a good relationship with, but she continued to kind of uphold his legacy as an artist. But then also folks that like were in the community were like, oh, my grandfather was in the Revolutionary War. Here's his powder horn. And that became a part of the collection, right? Like they weren't archivists, they weren't scholars, they were just individuals who had this knowledge that she wanted to share and kind of proliferate. And I think that that was really, it's a really beautiful way to think about education.
It's interesting to think about when you were describing the dining room table. I was thinking how equalizing of a space that is. So how that could even factor into the collecting that then happened with the DuSable Museum is a great point.
Yeah, for sure.
Is there a question? Yeah. Go right ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. I was looking for the hand raise. I always forget how to. Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I had a couple of questions. One about this network and how did these Black people know one another?
Mm,
And we find that, that persists in all types of venues, through professions, through religious, through many avenues. And my question to you is to what end, right? And
mhm,
so, to establish the connectedness, theoretically, what that means for the work and for what end.
mhm. Thank you for that question. I think one thing for for me is to understand again how these networks operated in order to sustain artistic careers, right? So, uh, somewhere like the Southside Community Arts Center is such a valuable institution, in part because it was able to exhibit artwork. It helped artists build up their CVs, demonstrate that they have, uh, knowledge that then they can bring other places. I think I am curious, I haven't explored it yet, but like so many of these individuals that I started to research were also part of the Rosenwald Fellowship. And so understanding how like some of these institutions that did start to form, how were they part of this way of creating viability and being like, no, Black artists can sustain themselves. They can have a career in this. Is something that I'm really interested in. And then also just understanding the kind of grassroots nature of it all. So somewhere like the DuSable, you look at its history and it's scrappy. It is a scrappy institution. It always has been. I and then understanding that like that scrappiness came with stuff. So like one of the letters that I found, a couple of the letters that I found were Margaret and Elizabeth Catlett arguing because they had done a show of Catlett's husband's artwork, and then some of the artwork got destroyed while it was in transport from Chicago back to Mexico. Um, but understanding that like that was, part of the way that they did exhibitions and how they put on art was just like, who do I know? Who do I care about? Who do I want to show other people? Um, rather than coming from like a canonical list of individuals and being like, these are the people we need to show or anything like that. Rather, it was who do I want to elevate and whose career do I want to see thrive? And I think that that's a really interesting kind of space to work in, especially when we're thinking about like this like canonization of like artistic merit.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think I was thinking too more towards not just that they were connected for this purpose in art, but what does connection mean in the
Mm,
context of a Black community? Because I think that's one of the larger questions here. And I was simplifying it, saying, how do these Black people know one another? Right? So, what does that mean? Because it's in everything, right? In every way. So,
mhm,
then how does this figure seeing like a Margaret Burroughs, how does she, exist within that, right?
Mm,
Or, how have we elevated her in certain respects, through your own research or whatever, in the community, because she's a known figure, of course. And we talked
right.
about that this summer.
Hmm.
Yeah, because yeah, she taught my uncle, my mom, so it was bigger than, it's a connected thing. So I think it's like worthy to look at that kind of connection and what
Yeah,
those connections mean.
absolutely. Thank you so much, Laverne. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chambliss, and of course, Dr. Hardy. We appreciate your time today. We look forward to your continued research, Dr. Hardy, and your sharing more with us. And thank our audience members for joining us today. You know kind of how to connect with us. Most of you do, but if you don't, just put this slide up. And if someone is interested in the fellowship program for 2025, information will be sent out shortly. So you can think about applying or share the information with others. If you are able to join us for the next session, it will be on November 14th, and that is at 12 noon Central Time. I will be sending out more information about the next session. But thanks again, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you, Melanie. I really appreciate it.